and welcome to CoronaNomics What Just Happened, brought to you by Econ Films, where we look at the biggest events of yet another historic week with you, our live audience. So please join the conversation on YouTube in the comments section or on Twitter using the hashtag CoronaNomics. I'm Lizzie Burden, economics reporter at The Telegraph.
And I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of The Independent. Well, it's been another frenetic 7 days of coronavirus-related news. Spain confirmed it won't quarantine British holidaymakers. We learned that we, like the Americans, will celebrate our Independence Day on the 4th of July when the Great British Pub reopens. And the tennis star Novak Djokovic caught COVID-19 after staging a non-socially distanced tennis tournament in the Balkans. Who could have foreseen that? Plus, we had this news from our trade secretary.
First time in many generations, the UK can strike free trade agreements with the rest of the world and export the breast of Britain abroad in ways we have not always been able. First time.
The breast of Britain. Well, music to the ears, no doubt, to the UK poultry exporters.
Joining us to talk about all that and more is Katie Martin, markets editor at the Financial Times and the inventor of the vomiting camel. We also have Giles Wilkes, former special advisor to Theresa May, who's now a senior fellow at the Institute for Government. Welcome to you both.
Hiya.
Hi. Well, now we've got a new feature to kick off this show. We choose our moments of the week as presenters and guests, but this week we're letting you, the audience, also have a shot at it. We're asking you to vote for your moment of the week on Twitter, and then we'll discuss it. So it's at CoronaNomics TV, and the choices we are giving you, I'm afraid we are constraining you slightly, are pubs reopening, air bridges to Europe, or 2 metre social distancing becoming 1 metre plus. So those are your options. Go on Twitter at CoronaNomics TV and make your choice, and then we will discuss it. Now, there are real consequences to these polls. They're not just for fun. There was a vote on our Twitter poll a couple of weeks ago when we had Lord Stuart Wood on about whether he should play us out on his guitar. Stay tuned for an update on that in this show. But let's get into our guests' moments of the week. Giles, let's start with you. What caught your eye this week?
Okay, this sounds like a dull thing, but I promise you it isn't. Sajid Javid, who, if you might recall, was briefly the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, wrote a pamphlet for the Centre for Policy Studies, which is the most Thatcherite of all of the think tanks, saying we should change the way the Bank of England operates. In particular, we should change what it targets from inflation to nominal growth. Now, to give some context as to why this is a big deal, my context would be this government, apart from the fact that it thinks that leaving a free trade area is the best way to pursue free trade, is actually very orthodox and dull in the economic policy making sphere. There's not many things that these famously wacky thinkers from Vote Leave believe in terms of ginning up the economy that you wouldn't be able to pick from any other spad tombola for the last 20 years, like planning reform or let's spend more money on science or anything else that a new Labour minister would be perfectly happy with. But this is radical, because the one thing that all of the politicians seem to have agreed for many years was the Bank of England reform of 1997, where they got it targeting inflation. That was a good idea. It took the whole business of monetary policy out of the grubby hands of politicians where they'd failed with it for like 40 years. So opening that up again is itself a really interesting moment. It recognises that the kind of conservative orthodoxy, and you can throw in other people like famous CoronaNomics guest star Jim O'Neill and Gerald Lyons, who's the closest economic advisor to Boris Johnson, and Bim Afolabi, who's another rising conservative MP. And a whole host of academics who say that the way the Bank of England operates hasn't been good enough for ginning up growth in the economy. And boy, do we have a growth problem now. So I think it's a sign of their desperation, but I think it's also a sign that they're willing to think radically, because I think Ben and I have discussed this over the many decades we've known each other, that the biggest problem the economy has had since 2007 and the financial crisis starting up has been demand, not enough spending. And the target that Saj was calling for is effectively to say that that's the thing that the Bank of England should care about too. More spending in the economy and we might get out of this hole.
It's interesting that it's a former Chancellor and a former Treasury Minister who are calling for this. It's a big radical idea. Is it too radical to be making a change like this in the middle of a crisis, or do you think it's something that Treasury officials are actively considering?
That's a really good, and I'd like to say really cruel way of putting it as well. But the big problem with this idea, I mean, some economists hate it, some think it makes no difference, some people absolutely love it and think it could solve everything. Politicians are incredibly nervous about it because what they hear you saying is, I'm going to stop caring about inflation. And to the man or woman in the street who votes for these politicians, that sounds like you don't care about the cost of living anymore. So, yeah, it's normally the politicians who've left government who suddenly say, hey, we should do this. The ones who worry about explaining it to a Newsnight audience who are on the Today programme are way more nervous. But, ideas get momentum. Once upon a time, having a Bank of England that was independent seemed outrageous. The Conservative Prime Minister John Major thought it was ridiculous that politicians would not be in charge of setting the mortgage rate. Now, if a politician did that, we'd think that was crazy. Orthodoxies do shift. And you start with outriders. And, Saj isn't that far from the leadership. He could have been in the leadership if he'd agreed to allow his special advisors to be the pets of Downing Street next door. So, it's making progress, I'd say.
Do you reckon he would have proposed it if he was the Chancellor?
Oh, that's a great one. People like me who now in my job in the think tank Institute for Government, as well as I work as a consultant for an outfit called Flint Global, our job is trying to pick up the echoes of how policies develop, because it mostly isn't the famous guys who appear on the TV who do things. You want to know what Treasury officials think, or Bank of England monetarists think, or the advisors in Downing Street. I've picked up signs that all of them are becoming more interested in it. It's a learning process. It's a probing and testing process. So, yeah, I think that kind of environment suggests that Saj might have been surrounded by a few people. And when I was in Downing Street, I put PowerPoints around because I'm a bit of a fan of the idea, saying, do you like this? And I got some people coming back to me and saying, yeah, I'm kind of interested. So, yeah, nobody you've heard of, nobody has to be voted in. But, yeah, I reckon he's now in an atmosphere where people are saying you've got a demand problem, and this might be one of your tools to help it.
Katie, I wonder what you think about it, because Jagjit Chadha from NISA was on the other week, and he was saying, we need to concentrate on fiscal measures and, not so much the monetary stuff, it's fiscal stuff we should be concentrating on. Is it a bit of a distraction, do you reckon?
I think I'm nowhere near enough of an economics wonk to be able to tell you what the relative merits of inflation targeting against NDP targeting are. I don't think, it's a bit of a leap into the unknown. It may or may not have a positive effect. It may or may not lead to superior outcomes to what we're currently getting. And I think we can all agree that inflation is behaving in extremely weird ways that lots of central banks have been struggling with for the past 12 years or something at least. So, yeah, maybe it is time to shake it up a bit. But really, does the government and does the Bank of England want to expend political energy on fleshing this out and explaining it to the public now? It seems unlikely to me. And as you say, there is a case for concentrating on the fiscal. The UK government can borrow for really long maturities for £0 and 0 pence. If we're looking for quick hit ways to stimulate the economy, that's got to be an easier win, right?
Katie, can I just ask you, from a kind of markets perspective, which is where your expertise is, changing the Bank of England's mandate when we're always told that inflation targeting has been such an important thing in getting credibility in financial markets for UK monetary policy, how do you think markets would react to such a change?
I think it would depend whether the UK was going it alone. If there was some sort of agreement at a G7 level or something, this is something that everyone's going to look at the same time, then maybe we wouldn't be picked out. If the UK went it alone, I think it would introduce a new level of uncertainty into how the central bank responds to economic signals. One thing that is worth bearing in mind, though, is that, yes, the Bank of England is an inflation targeter, like most central banks are these days, but it's not a slavish inflation targeter. It is prepared to look through short-term blips on the upside or the downside. It doesn't, there's the famous moment from the European Central Bank when Jean-Claude Trichet jacked up interest rates in the middle of a crisis because there was an oil-led inflation shock. That's widely regarded as having been a policy mistake. The Bank of England doesn't tend to respond like that, so it's not obvious that it's rigid now. But yeah, if the UK went it alone, I think it would inject a new note of potential instability into UK markets, which are not having the best time as it is anyway. So possibly unwise.
I mean, Katie's right, and that's the answer the Bank of England would give. They'd say, look, we understand it's flexible inflation target. We see through little bumps in the road. However, that year 2011, when Jean-Claude Trichet made such mistakes, he made an even worse one in 2008. You did nevertheless have at least 3 members of the MPC saying, hey, why didn't we raise rates? Because we're going to have an inflation print of like 4.5% later. That's way outside target. Don't we need to restore credibility? Now, if you believe that economies are driven not just by what people do, but by expectations of the future course of the economy, having a third of the MPC thinking the economy is going fast enough, in 2011, when it was deeply depressed and unemployment was 8 or 9%, a third of the monetary policymakers thought we're going too fast. That tells you, A, the inflation signal is a lousy one. As Katie says, it sends really stupid signals all of the time. And B, you can't be absolutely certain the Bank of England has got your back. And when you're deeply uncertain about the future, you're worried about your finances, you're a businessman choosing whether to invest or not, there's a 1 in 50 chance that they're going to do something crazy like Trichet did. You might not invest. And we've had a very weak recovery. That might have been a part of it.
On the subject of the Bank of England, the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, was asked in an interview this week what would have happened if the bank hadn't intervened in UK government debt markets with £200 billion worth of quantitative easing. And he said, I think the prospects would have been very bad. It would have been very serious. And a lot of people interpreted that as him saying that the UK government was basically going bust. Here's a question from Anna Katerina in Aberdeen. She says, was the UK government really insolvent in March, or was it just a once in 100-year anomaly that the banks didn't factor in a pandemic in their risk models? Katie, do you think everyone's just been misinterpreting the governor?
I think there is an element of things getting a bit lost in translation, but I think from looking at some of the context behind what Andrew Bailey was saying in that interview, what he was acknowledging, and something that I think a lot of people miss, is how close the financial system came to absolute disaster in March. We were really close globally. It was not a great period in my life. And I think what he was saying correctly was that if the Bank of England hadn't stepped in, and by extension, if other central banks hadn't stepped in and just said, okay, look, just have all the money, just make this, please go away, I'm not sure we would have made it. The bond market, which is the bit that he's referring to recently, completely misfired in that week in March, and that's the bit that he's referring to. So stock markets crashing, one thing, companies getting revalued effectively by investors, that's what markets are supposed to do. What markets are not supposed to do is to hammer the bond market at the same time. But that was just a mark of how much trouble we were in at that point. And central banks know that. And had they not come in to support that market, I think we could have been looking at something significantly uglier than what we've already got, which is not great.
Giles, do you reckon the government... Go on.
No, I was going to say the phrase that got into the press was Britain going bust. Now, countries can go bust. It is possible. I mean, Germany was bust in 1923 when the French were sending in people to take telegraph poles in payment. I mean, Britain used to go around like a big old bailiff and take goods off people when they were literally couldn't afford the stuff they were trying to import. Britain might have been kind of bust in 1976. We needed the IMF to make good on our foreign exchange commitments. But we're nowhere near bust. But the market's being so disorderly that it panics the hell out of everybody, and people who might otherwise have remained solvent in the economy not being solvent because that bond market was totally dysfunctional. Yeah, that might well have happened. He did save us from quite serious problems. Sorry, I interrupted you, Lizzie.
No, I was going to ask you that very question. If any of you've got a question at home, don't forget you can ask away on the YouTube comments or on Twitter using #CoronaNomics.
And let's move on to Katie's moment of the week. Take it away, Katie.
Well, it's been quite a few days in the European business world and for the Financial Times. Today was the day that Wirecard collapsed. Wirecard is a big German payments company. It was the darling of the German and European fintech scene, and the FT started reporting in 2015 that there were questions over its accounting, and we then ended up in an extremely lengthy process of having to defend our reporting. And it's only in the past week or so that there's been special audits that have been conducted that have concluded, no, sure, we don't know where this money is. There's 1.9 billion euros that we just can't account for. We don't think it exists. The chief executive was arrested, and the whole episode has raised a number of questions around why the German press didn't pick this up, with some notable exceptions, why the German regulator stuck up for Wirecard over such a long time, why lots of bank analysts were willing to put buy recommendations on the stock, which has just been obliterated. Everybody has been left with quite a lot of egg on their face at this point. And one interesting wrinkle around how the FT reported this, as I say, it started raising questions about this in 2015, so we're going back a fair way. FT reporters were the targets of hacking attempts. They were subject to surveillance. They were followed. They were spied on. You know, some of the sort of side story around this, which I do recommend you check out on the FT website, around the surveillance that was funded by a former Libyan intelligence chief to try and identify the short sellers and the journalists that were looking into this, is movie stuff. So it's been, you know, the global media industry is not in great shape at the moment. This is one of those stories that tells you that it is worth it, and that you know, that it's worth putting resources into stories that matter.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an amazing story, really. I mean, it's the sort of story that almost dents your faith in the sort of the capitalist market system in a way, because, as you say, the regulator wasn't doing its job properly. The auditors weren't doing their job properly. The media, obviously the exception of the FT, weren't doing their job properly. You know, you kind of wonder, this is much bigger than one crooked individual company. This is about the way the system failed in many ways. And as you say, it's very worth looking at it from that broader perspective rather than just being about a single company. Now, we've got a question on this subject of Wirecard and how it relates to the sort of the current environment from Alex from London. He sent this in.
Do you think the coronavirus will expose more tech companies who have prioritized growth over governance? As Warren Buffett says, it's only when the tide goes out that you find out who's been swimming naked.
So I wonder if we can stick with you on that, Katie. I mean, do you have a sense that because, you know, this sort of market turmoil that we've seen and the big knock to many companies' profit outlooks and their revenues, are we going to see more? Could we see more stories like this emerging, do you feel?
I think Wirecard is a very specific example of a huge accounting scandal that is kind of unrelated to coronavirus, honestly. But what I also think is the outlook for corporate earnings now in the US, in the UK, across Europe, everywhere. Nobody has got a Scooby. What is going on? What kind of money they're going to make this year? What kind of money they're going to make next year? We've never been in an environment where companies and their shareholders have had less clarity around how they're going to survive this experience. A lot of companies are not going to make it. They're just not going to make it. And it doesn't mean that they're fraudulent, and it doesn't mean that they've been running the business badly. It just means that they've been hit by a shock that they couldn't possibly have predicted. And it's going to be very painful. I think we need to be realistic around, you know, yes, as I was saying earlier, central banks sort of pulled markets back from the brink, and governments are pumping money into the system. But there's just a lot of businesses that aren't going to survive. And it's sort of horrible, but true.
Yeah. And Giles, you were giving evidence before the Treasury Select Committee, I think, a few weeks ago. And you said the amount of money and loans going out the door to smaller companies was a red flag. I mean, can we take it from that you expect a lot of kind of damage and fallout from this period?
Oh, huge amount. I mean, in a slightly more tasteful way, J.K. Galbraith, the great sort of left-wing economist post-war in America, used to have a word for this stuff called the bezel. He said there's an amount of money that when everything's rising, people find it really easy to sort of nick off their own company and embezzle, in effect. So he said there's an amount of money called the bezel that people basically distribute and play with. And you saw it with like Bernie Madoff in the great financial crisis, and all sorts of frauds in the dot-com thing. When markets are rising, there's opportunities to pilfer. When things come down again, the cash has to come back, and suddenly somebody goes in and does the maths, and it doesn't work anymore. So yeah, there's a real opportunity now with these bounce back loans. It's slightly different in that I mean they are so absurdly good value that popular money advice websites, let's put it that way, are saying take this loan out. If you qualify, get it anyway. Because you've probably got a credit card or you've got a mortgage or something. You certainly don't have a loan where you can tick 3 or 4 boxes and you're going to get the money full stop. And by the way, what's the chance of the government going to 900,000 micro enterprises in the recovery phase of this crisis, which could be for years, and taking all the money back off you? So yeah, it's giving out free money. And just while I was at it, I looked at the FT website just now to see why the markets have rallied. It is the greatest newspaper. $14 billion of money has been sent to dead Americans. So, yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot of fraud going on, a lot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's one of the things I've been thinking about actually in this is that if you don't avail yourself of the loans and support which is available, whether or not you need it as a business, you could be put at a relative disadvantage to others who do avail themselves of it. So obviously the incentives are all stacked in to get as much as you can, which may not be the best thing for individual companies or for the public finances. We've had a question in. It's slightly unrelated, but I'm going to put it in now because I'm not going to ask you your answers to it straight away because it's a bit of a tough one. But I'll flag it now. It's a question from our friends at the Economics in 10 group, and they ask, which economist from history has the most useful stuff to say for these unprecedented times? So I'm not going to put you on the spot right now, so let you think about that as we go through.
All right.
If you've got any questions at all like those guys, ask away on the YouTube comments or in Twitter using the hashtag CoronaNomics.
Now, Ben, what was your moment of the week?
Well, my moment of the week was when that great legend of stage and screen, Dame Judi Dench, said that she feared that theatres may not open again in her lifetime. I mean, what a headline that is. Obviously, the context here is that she's talking about the fact that although restaurants and pubs are due to open on the 4th of July, the same is not true for theatres and concert halls. And it's really unclear when live performances will be allowed to happen again because of the safety concerns about the spread of the disease. I think this is a real moment. It's really coming into focus the fate of these performance groups, theatres, and a lot of the people who are employed with them. Now, the arts lobby, as you will know, our guests will know, is pushing for special support from the government because of this sort of late timetable or non-existent timetable of getting back to business as normal. And the Prime Minister's spokesman confirmed this week that they are thinking about it, although nothing definite yet. Now, there's a lot of talk about building back better in the wake of this crisis. And I think the performing arts should definitely be part of that conversation, not necessarily because it's, that it's such an incredibly important part of the economy for driving revenues and jobs, but because it's such an important part for our social lives, the civilized values which we hold dear. And I think I'm glad that it's being put up the agenda for that reason. Now, there's on the subject of sort of areas or sectors of the economy which have been missing out. We've also had a lot of disquiet about that, as you will know as well, as our guests will know. The Treasury Select Committee laid out in quite comprehensive detail all the businesses and individuals who have not been able to avail of themselves of the extensive support which the government has put forward for people. And on that subject, we've got a question a live question from Kate from Streatham. Hello, Kate.
Hello, good evening, everybody.
Good evening. Do you want to put your question to our guests?
Yeah, of course. So on the 23rd of March, I was due to start my new job, which was based in events and hospitality. Due to the government-enforced lockdown, which caused closures of restaurants and events, my new employer's business dried up, leaving them to furlough existing staff and delay my start date. So there's a big group of new starters in a similar position who have been excluded from the furlough scheme because of restrictions created by specific dates picked by the government to reduce the risk of fraud. There are new starters who can't receive universal credit or have reached out to old employees asking to be furloughed, only to be rejected, myself included. Do you think the Chancellor should include new starters in the furlough scheme and backdate payments from the start date of the scheme to make up for the huge financial hardship we have faced due to this discrimination?
So, Giles, maybe you could field that one first.
Yeah.
I mean, is it a good idea to sort of reopen the furlough? The Chancellor said the furlough scheme is now shut, but should that be revisited? Should it be reopened to help people like Kate?
Look, it's very easy to just say a straight yes, but I want to say, a straight yes. He should. I mean, the whole design of these bailout schemes from the outset should have been, we should act as if you had got insurance against this disaster, and we're paying out on the insurance. And an awful lot of the economy, as you know, has been treated in that way, in particular through the furlough scheme. Now, on the whole, I still think the Chancellor's performance has been really good. It's very hard to turn around that quickly, particularly if you're a bit of a Thatcherite, and give a whole load of money to people so quickly. But if the US government can give $14 billion to dead Americans, and if the UK government can give $28 billion in loans in just a month to every micro industry that kind of applies for it, they could surely have treated your set of people in the same way. And if they're worried about fraud or so forth, they could easily have said, look, we're giving you this money, we're keeping your details, we'll come back and check when it's possible to check later. And if we find that there is fraud, this grant turns out to have been a loan. They're kind of acting in that way, I reckon, implicitly through the bounce back loans. You know, we're going to come back and get this money off you, but only when we can really get round to it. So they really should be. I mean, I'm not criticising them too much because they've done an awful lot, but they shouldn't just be saying this is over now, because it still matters to you, and you being in a strong position later is going to help all of us help make the economy stronger in the months ahead.
I think one of our it was just with the whole fraud aspect. One of our main reasons was that we all have contracts, we all have email correspondence, we all have a confirmed job offer. So for that, fraud being used as an excuse wasn't very fair, because we have a paper trail, so therefore why can't we be included when we have a genuine job offer?
I was going to say,
it doesn't sound like it's good enough.
When the Chancellor was on Andrew Marr the other day, he said the same thing again. We did this in such pace that, of course, we couldn't get everything perfect. But I mean, isn't it that excuse? We've heard it a bit too many times now. Isn't it time to iterate already? What do you reckon, Katie?
I think, well, first of all, Kate, I feel absolutely terrible for you. That's just a really awful situation, and it's not your fault. And I think you're holding it together incredibly well in the circumstances. I'm not sure I'd be doing so well. I think basically what Giles said. Look, you've obviously got a genuine case here, and as the others were just saying, it has been really difficult for the government to get this right first time. They had to work at extraordinary speed, but it does seem like you're just one of. There are just pockets of people who've fallen through the net, and it's just horrible. And I really feel for you, and I hope you are lobbying your MP and anybody who will listen to you to press the case.
I've had so my local MPs sent a letter to my previous employer, but we've also had other MPs lobbying it. So Sir Ed Davies been involved quite a lot. So he's written to the Chancellor. So it's just waiting for that acknowledgement and hoping that he'll help us and all the other people. I mean, you've got the self-employed and lots of other people in the same situation. So it's just hoping that, we're tax-paying citizens, so we kind of deserve the rights as everybody else. So hopefully he'll see that.
Yeah. Well, brilliant. Well, thanks for coming on, Kate. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
We wish you the best of luck with your difficult circumstances. Now we've got a question which is in a similar area, which was pre-recorded earlier by Rachel. Let's see if we can hear that.
Last week, the Treasury published its official report confirming that it is at least 1 million taxpayers who've been excluded, and they called upon the government to urgently take action. The government has yet to respond. How would you fix this problem? And how do you recommend that we continue pressure on the government, given the urgency of the situation?
Now, let's go. I mean, Giles, you've sort of given your broad view earlier, but let's talk about specifics from being on the inside. How do you go to a minister and say, listen, we think there's a problem here. We know you said you don't want to do it, but we think you do. How do you, as an advisor, approach a situation like that?
Look, this is really difficult, and the majority of my experience in government was from 2010, when the argument was never about giving anyone any money. It was always about how much you're taking from them and how much you're cutting, and sort of making it incredibly salient to the MPs. I mean, one fact about MPs nowadays, which isn't properly appreciated, is they meet voters all the time. They meet more normal people in a normal week than we would in a year, and they are acutely aware when these kind of situations come to people. The reason that people like Mel Stride, who's the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, are so concerned about this is because he will be meeting an awful lot of, I'm assuming he's talking here about the people, the directors of companies who pay themselves through dividends and don't count the schemes and fall through the cracks. He'll be meeting a lot of them. And so those sort of personal stories into MPs' boxes, because MPs are now, they're asserting themselves in ways that just wasn't normal 20, 30 years ago. Even with this big 80-seat majority, a lot of them are willing to turn around to the government and say, I'm not happy. They would have done it over the, I was about to say Daniel Rashford, but I think it's Marcus Rashford's campaign on Facebook. Yes. And I think they would be willing perhaps to look at this. So MPs would be number one. It's never easy though.
Yeah, I mean, Katie, it's quite interesting, isn't it, from the outside, seeing ministers responding to something like Marcus Rashford, but then not responding to the huge outcry about something, Dominic Cummings, for instance. I mean, do you detect any kind of any rhyme or reason in what they will bend to and what they won't?
No, I mean, I feel like there's the other situation involving Richard Desmond as well at the moment, which is rattling through. I think it's really difficult to get a handle on where the line is with the government currently. I mean, what happened with Marcus Rashford was just extraordinary. You know, he just made a simple point really well, and it was an unarguable point. I just hope there are some people that have fallen through the cracks, in the furlough scheme, that can make a similar point. It's difficult to make that point loudly. And I think one other sort of complication with it is that a lot of the sort of, freelancers who pay themselves through dividends are frankly not on the breadline. It's difficult to make a case for them. But I know people like that myself who are caught in that situation, and it's desperate. They've just got absolutely nothing. So you can just hope that someone listens to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if you've got a question, as we said, do ask us on Twitter, hashtag CoronaNomics, or in the YouTube comments. Now we're going to move on to Lizzie's moment of the week.
Well, I thought that it was pretty interesting that all this speculation about a VAT cut in the Chancellor's mini budget / summer statement next month. So it was a proposal by the former Chancellor, Lord Darling, and it's what he did when he was Chancellor after the financial crisis. But even then, PwC did a study showing that it had a negligible effect on spending. And many people have said this crisis is really different. So it's people not spending because they're unable to, not because they're unwilling. So I wonder what both of you think, Katie and Giles. I mean, do you think that it'll actually be effective? If you're going to do a VAT cut, surely you have to put an end date on when you're going to have it cut till, so that people don't sit on their cash until the end point. But then, how do we know if there's going to be another wave of coronavirus when that endpoint is? Couldn't it just be a massive disaster for the economy? I'll go to you, Katie, first.
Am I right in thinking it's contingent also on the on a lot of other things coming into effect, like the 1 meter thing and like there being no resurgence in the virus? I think it's incredibly difficult to predict what is going to happen with household spending now. And a lot of investors, for example, that I speak to, when they're talking about which companies' shares they're going to buy, they say, listen, companies have just had a near-death experience. They're going to be significantly more cautious in what they spend money on from here on out, just in case anything like this were to happen again. Normal people are exactly the same. Are you going to head out and buy a car or a sofa or something like that if you have that extra layer of uncertainty over your job security. And whether a VAT cut would make any difference to that calculation, I honestly don't know. And I think we are just operating, we're completely flying blind here. Maybe it would work, maybe it's worth giving it a go, maybe it wouldn't do any harm, especially if we make it time limited. But I'm not sure anyone can say with any degree of confidence that it will help.
Giles, don't you think it'll all just go in Amazon's pocket? Everyone will just spend it online?
If it goes anywhere, but that's a really good point. I mean, spending boosts will often just go overseas. And when in the big post-war period, when they used to look at ginning up the economy, they used to look really carefully about whether it just flowed overseas in gold. In this case, it's really hard to see whether it will actually address the real problem the economy has, which is better expressed by the people you've had on asking questions. Some people have been hit really, really hard. Some people are basically fine. And like us, we kind of work at home and the incomes are roughly the same. And we've been saving a lot because we haven't been able to go out. Some people have been hit monstrously. So if he really thinks he's got £15 billion to deploy, he should be trying to use it to make some people whole, because as you put really well, some people just can't spend the money they would like to. It would just go into savings, and a lot of those savings are not really necessary from an economic point of view. So I would really put it near the bottom of my list if I was the Chancellor.
Yeah, I think I'd link that to my my answer to who was the economist from history with the most relevant thoughts for now.
Yeah.
For me, it would be John Maynard Keynes, not because of the demand element of his ideas, but because of the radical uncertainty element. Because as you've been saying, we just don't know what state of public sentiment there will be for going out. So whether a VAT cut will be effective or not, we don't know what state of remission the disease is going to be in. You don't want to be sending people into restaurants and bars, etc., at just the time when you'd want them to be to not be doing that. So radical uncertainty, as outlined by John Maynard Keynes, I think is a pretty good idea for the moment. Giles, have you had time to think?
I can't. I'm not going to forgive you for having nicked my idea. Because I think I'll give other reasons. If anyone here has read the great biography of Keynes by Skidelsky, the 3-volume masterpiece, it's absolutely fantastic, and it reminds you of what an incredibly original thinker from first principles he often was. He was looking at the Indian currency when he was still in his 30s, thinking about war reparations from scratch. When he wrote that great book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, he was thinking about financial problems in the 20s. He wrote one of the great monetarist tracts. He then reinvented macroeconomics. And then the bit that I always remember reading that biography is at the end of the war, when he's asked again, think about a totally unique, unprecedented problem. How do you deal with a bankrupt state like the UK? He was there in America negotiating against the most powerful country in the world at the height of its power. And all the amazing people around the table were just spellbound by him. You could have the brightest people in Washington, and they were sitting there just gobsmacked by the intelligence and just the raw ability to reason from first principles. He was like a force in his own right. You can be sure that he would have thought things through in an incredibly original way. Possibly the brightest British man of the century. So, Keynes definitely.
They don't make them like that anymore. And now Katie is basically...
They do.
Yeah, they appear on CoronaNomics.
He was on the Treasury Select Committee the other week, and so we've still got them like him.
We've got that. But Katie, is he your economist of the moment from history as well?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, clearly Giles is much more of a wonk on this than I ever will be. But yeah, that's got to be the framework, and government assistance has got to be the answer in the absence of any other sensible solutions.
That's right, absolutely. Well, let's go to our audience poll. We asked you at the start of the programme what your moment of the week was as the audience. We gave you a choice of 3. A reminder of what they were. They are pubs reopening, the possibility of air bridges to Europe, enabling you to go on holiday, and 2-metre social distancing becoming 1 metre plus. So I think we can hopefully bring up the results of that in front of you, and the winner is maybe not that surprising, pubs reopening. So that's what we're going to talk about. So who's going to the pub on the 4th of July out of our guests? Giles, are you going to be in there?
No, we're having a very carefully socially distanced dinner party with some people who live around nearby, and the kids all play together. So no, we're making our own little pub for the evening. Forget that. Right,
excellent. And Katie, are you looking forward to going into a public bar?
Lord knows I am missing the pub, and I mean my kids are missing the pub. If you ask them what's the number one thing you want to do when we come out of lockdown, they say the pub, which probably makes me a really bad mother.
I'm not going to ask how old they are.
Yeah, not old enough to drink. But no, I'm not going to the pub. It sounds rubbish. Like, you won't be able to just like hang out and see your friends and give people a hug that you just randomly bump into in the pub. That's the whole point of going to your local, is, you know, just the chit chat. I mean, and yeah, I'll go back as soon as it's safe and advisable to do that. But I can't see myself being there on day one. The kids maybe, but not me. Yeah.
They can tell you what it's like. What about you, Lizzie? Are you missing the pub, Lizzie?
No, I don't like. I'm very, very careful. I am not a rule breaker, and even if it's allowed, I wouldn't want drunk people, you know, coming into me with their Rona. So absolutely not. I will be drinking at home.
Well, that's heartening to hear. Right, well, that's all we've got time for this week. Thanks so much to our guests, Katie and Giles, for taking us on a whirlwind tour of everything from dodgy German tech companies to demand management to John Maynard Keynes. Thank you also for watching at home and for sending in questions. Please do keep them coming in. Apologies if we didn't get to yours this week. We will hopefully do so in future weeks. And please keep suggestions coming about what else we might cover.
You can check out our latest episode on YouTube. It's an interview with Robert Reich, the former US Labour Secretary who served in the administrations of President Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at CoronaNomics TV for all our latest updates.
Now, I mentioned earlier that a couple of weeks ago, we asked Lord Stuart Wood to play us out on his guitar. He wasn't able to do it, sadly, on the episode itself, but he did very, very kindly send us a recording of him playing our theme tune. So we can hear that shortly. And if you at home fancy playing us out, playing our outro as well, by all means, get in touch. But in the meantime, thank you again for watching, and take it away, Lord Wood.